I am happy to come here for this past Veterans Day to honor the combat nurses. I'm going to go back here. This book took 5 years of research and writing. It is historically accurate with a history section in the index and a bibliography. Please excuse any of the slide photos that may be blurry. Why? Because they were produced 79 years ago during World War II. The Army Nurse Corps was established in 1901. A nurse had to be unmarried between the ages of 40 years old with a registered nurse degree. Married nurses were accepted not until October 1942. Only white nurses were accepted. Black nurses did not progress in the Army Nurse Corps because of segregation laws. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation between the Black and white race was constitutional, and states could establish separate but not so equal laws. Fines and imprisonment could be imposed if the white race did not enforce segregation. 30 out of 48 states had segregation laws. Many were not overturned until 1965. Look at all the facilities and items that were segregated. Here are signs that could be seen during the time. Yeah, I'm getting a reverberation. Thank you. I think I did. I don't know. Thank you, Lynn. Great mic, handy person. In order to join the American Red Cross, the nurses had, in order to join the Army Nurse Corps, the nurses had to go down to the American Red Cross to join up. American Red Cross also took blood donations, but only from the white race. Here is a poem written by a high school student in 1941. Had I wealth, I'd burn it all, not 1 cent for the Red Cross call. Our money is good. Our blood is bad, but still that shouldn't make us mad. Are they afraid they'll all turn black? Is that why our blood they lack? So the American Red Cross accepted blood from Black donors in 1942. However, it had to be segregated and only used by Black people. It also, all donated blood had to be labeled with the letter N for Negro. Now, in the early 1800s, it was discovered that skin cells determine the color of one's skin. The Black nurses who wanted to join the Army Nurse Corps had to go to the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses. In 1938, that was the beginning of World War II, when Germany took over Austria and other countries. At that time, there were over 600 white registered nurses and over 500 Black registered nurses, and there was still a shortage. The Surgeon General in March 1941 established a quota system of accepting 185 Black nurses to be accepted into the Army Nurse Corps. However, only 22 were activated. The white nurses were required to attend basic training. There were many Army camps throughout the United States, the oldest one being Fort Huachuca, Arizona, and they took basic training in April 1941. The Black nurses were not accepted at Fort Huachuca until July 1942 because they were waiting for barracks, separate barracks to be built, and they could only work in the all-Black soldiers' hospital. Both races took basic training, and they were instructed only by white officers, even though there were Black officers who were stationed there who were capable. Here are the white nurses in basic training. After passing basic training, the Black nurses and white nurses worked in segregated hospitals, giving inoculations. They took x-rays, made charts, did surgery prep. In the morning, they attended lectures on tropical diseases, such as the dreaded malaria, and learned how to treat gangrene. Venereal disease was very prevalent. And the nurses were given kits to give the soldiers to try to prevent venereal disease. Here are two posters that were seen at the time. There's so many more even. Both of the nurses had their own separate officers' club. The Mountain View Negro Officers Club in 1942, the nurses got to hear such celebrities such as Louis Armstrong and Lena Horne. The first assignment the Black nurses received was to go to Camp Florence, Arizona, to care for captured German prisoners. Well, both the Black race, the Black nurses and white nurses did not want to care for the enemy, but the Black nurses, when they were deployed, they released the white nurses who happily were stationed overseas. This was because of the 1929 Geneva Convention, and their job was to give medical care to the prisoners of war. The Black nurses were very fearful of the German prisoners of war. They had heard that they thought of them as subhuman, and they were reassured that the prisoners of war had to sign a statement denouncing fascism. And if they didn't, they were sent to a maximum security prison. There were so many prisoners of war camps throughout the United States. There was a labor shortage, so the prisoners of war were used to do farming and picking cotton for military uniforms. And there was a shortage because all of our men went overseas to the military, and a lot of our women worked in factories. At last, the Black nurses were so happy. The quota was raised by the War Department, so they were finally sent overseas to Liberia, West Africa, by ship. Here are the Black Army nurses. There were 30 nurses sent to Liberia in new uniforms. They were overjoyed to be here. In Liberia, there were many American Black soldiers stationed, and their job was to care for any of the Black soldiers. The job of the Black soldiers in Liberia was to protect the rubber plantations needed for military vehicles and army aircraft. They also protected the airfields. Once a month, the Black nurses got to go to the village and care for over 15 tribes of natives. This was a joyful experience for them. Unfortunately, half of the 30 nurses came down with the dreaded disease of malaria, and they were all sent home. The Black nurses that did not get malaria were sent to Camp Livingston in Louisiana for a few months to care for the huge amount of Black soldiers training there. But a few months later, they were deployed overseas. All the nurses wanted the overseas experience to see the world. The 16 Black nurses with one Black physician got to travel in this colossal transport airplane. A lot of the nurses did not like this. They had never seen an airplane, and they didn't really want to go in it. But they knew this was the only way they were going to get to North Burma in the continent of Asia. A Black physician also went with them. They first stayed overnight in India, then were transported by 2 trucks to northern Burma, Tagap, Burma. There was a war going on here. Let's see if I can use this. Here's India, Burma, China. And they were stationed in Leto, Tagap. And there were soldiers here. This is the Leto Road. There were soldiers stationed here to rebuild the Leto Road that the Imperial Japanese Army had closed. It was a critical road to transport supplies from India to China. China was our ally. So the Black nurses and the one physician were dropped into the jungle, and they walked way high up in this windy jungle in full army uniforms, and their stockings got caught on the vines, and everybody was sweating with ties on. They walked up this path looking for the hospital. They were greeted by the commanding surgeon, who was thrilled to see the nurses because there were no nurses there. Here are the nurses that served in Tagap, Burma. They were brought to the middle of the jungle. There was a pile of tents that they had to put together themselves. This is where they would sleep for several months until their bamboo bashes would be built. They They were very high up, and this was a view from their jungle stay. It is the Patkai Mountains with the 4,200 peak. It was quite an experience. They would sit on a bench, eat food out of cans, because that's all they really got, because all food had to be dropped by parachute. They'd sit and eat out of their cans, and in the hot jungle, looking at snow for the first time. This is the primitive hospital half the Black nurses would be working in. Half the nurses were to work in the primitive hospital, with the other half were to help supervise the building of a new hospital. This is the old hospital site. And sure enough, they had to supervise the natives on elephants building the new hospital and helping rebuild the Lido Road that the Japanese had closed. Here are the natives that were supervised and worked very hard. Our allies were the Chinese, and they fought the Japanese. Our Black nurses would care for any battlefield wounds, which they only had textbook knowledge of course. Especially, here are the Chinese soldiers during the monsoon season that went from May to November, where there were torrential rains and many accidents for the nurses to care for. There were over 1,000 Black soldiers that worked to reopen the vital Lido Road, and the nurses cared for the many Black soldiers. They were Black American soldiers, by the way. Here they are transporting supplies from Burma to China for the Chinese soldiers. So this is Lido Road. It's incredible. And do you see this little dot? It's a truck. And the nurses cared for a lot of accidents that occurred opening Lido Road. Sometimes a truck would careen off the cliff. There were over 40 venomous snakes in Burma. They had to care for snake bites. There were animal attacks, and they had to help deal with those wounds as well. Well, guess what? They finally got their bashes, their bamboo bashes, just in time for the monsoon season. Note that they are built up on stilts. They love their bashes. At last, The hospital was completed January 1945. There were now 22 Black physicians. It was a beautiful, well-equipped hospital. They also built recreation facilities for the first time, and the Black nurses loved going to the officers' club for dances. And at last, the Burma-Lido Road was finished January 28th, 1945. And the China-Burma, the China-Burma Indian War was over. World War II was over. September 2nd, 1945, the Surgeon General actually came to TACAP and praised the staff for the tremendous work they had done on the beautiful modern hospital in primitive conditions and a trying climate. Everyone received a higher rank and raise, and they were thanked for their patriotism. There was a big party held in the officers' club, and the commanding surgeon informed the staff that the hospital was no longer needed. Chinese patients were sent home. Black soldiers were redeployed. They were required to tear down the hospital, box up all the equipment to be sent back to the United States. Well, there was a rumor heard that in India, the hospital there was torn down and the equipment boxed up, and it was all thrown into the ocean because it was too expensive to transport back to the United States. All the medical personnel were sent home. And at last, the GI Bill in 1944 was signed into law by the president. It provided World War II veterans with funds for college education, unemployment insurance, and housing. And finally, Executive Order 9981 banned segregation in the armed forces. There were only 479 Black nurses who served in 6 countries during World War II due to segregation laws and imposed quota system, whereas over 59,000 white nurses served in every theater of the war. Keep in mind, there was always a nursing shortage and plenty of Black nurses available. After the war, the Black nurses, some who remained in the Army, were deployed to the Korean War in 1950, and they got to work with white nurses for the first time because of integration. Some of the Black nurses furthered their education with the GI Bill, and some married and had families. Now, I'm going to briefly talk about the white nurses. 53 white nurses were deployed to Sternberg Military Hospital in the Manila, Philippines. This was before the war. The hospital was beautiful, very modern, and they worked very short hours because of the heat. They also worked with 25 Filipina nurses. It was an idyllic paradise there. Every Friday night, the white nurses would put on their gorgeous ball gowns and go to the Navy Army Officers Club, dance with the handsome officers in their uniforms. On their days off, they played tennis, they saw movies, they played golf. It was a glorious experience. But guess what? World War II occurred December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Imperial Japanese. And the staff at Sternberg Hospital was told, get ready, the Philippines might be bombed. And you can see on the map here, here's the United States, here's Hawaii, and here's Philippines. Sternberg was the largest hospital in that area of the Philippines. And they were told to get ready. The medics put cots all over the hospital. There were several smaller hospitals, and other Army camps did get bombed 14 hours after Pearl Harbor. The medics were trained, the nurses had to train the medics to be nurses, and the physicians trained the nurses to become doctors. They were inundated with injuries coming from all over the Philippines by ambulance. Here is a nurse administering anesthesia for the first time. This was morphine. And then Manila Harbor was bombed by the Japanese army shortly thereafter. And it shook the hospital. Windows were blown out. Manila was being destroyed. General MacArthur surrendered Manila. He ordered the 53 Army nurses and 26 Filipina nurses to escape to Bataan. And you can see here's Manila, here's Bataan. The nurses were transported by 2 Army trucks and dropped into the jungle and climbed looking for the hospital. They were greeted by a commanding surgeon who told the nurses they would have to set up barracks and a hospital. At least they had help of 100 medics. There were no patients there yet, and only 2 physicians, long, dirty shacks with no beds. The supplies that were from 1901 had to be brought up from warehouses on the beach. They were only there 1 week when the Imperial Japanese Army started bombing LeMay, Bataan. And here is a dogfight with the Imperial Japanese and our American plane. 40 physicians, thank God, arrived. The battlefield was 13 miles away. Casualties came by vehicle and mule. Surgery was performed 24 hours a day. There were 102 major surgeries performed. Operating rooms became assembly lines. They could only eat one meal a day since it came from enemy-occupied Manila by boat. After 1 month, the hospital commander came in and told everyone to evacuate to the safety of Baguio, Luzon. They had to pack up the patients and leave. Baguio, Luzon was a rough but finished site. It at least had protected 2 acres of mountainous area, which made for less malaria from mosquitoes. They were there only 2 weeks and the bombing started again. 4,500 sick and wounded soldiers arrived. There were 1,000 cases a day with a patient population of over 7,000. Plus, they had to care for the captured Japanese prisoners of war. Food stopped arriving by boat or parachute drops. The nurses were told to strap down the patients, everybody go outside, find a foxhole and stay in it, waiting for the bombing to stop. Rosemary Hogan and Rita Palmer were hit in their foxholes by shrapnel. And 6 weeks later, Bataan was surrendered. They all, the nurses, traveled by ship to the secret island of Corregidor. It was an underground hospital. As you can see, they were in Manila, they went to Bataan, and now to Corregidor. The nurses were brought to Malinta Tunnel, and there were 20 numbered tunnels, 750 feet long, 25 feet wide. They were static to be underground in the safety away from the bombing up above. Also, there were lights on all the time, and they mostly had used flashlights in the jungle hospitals. They were greeted warmly. This hospital was fully functioning. There were other nurses there. They were welcomed. There was an abundance of food. And the first thing they were served was a Coca-Cola ice cream float. So they were very happy and relieved to get away from the bombing. But it's a continuous thing. 2 weeks later, the Japanese Imperial Army attacked the island. Barges were unable to bring supplies, which became a shortage. This is what the underground hospital and tunnels looked like, very faded. It became hellish inside. Flakes of concrete were flying around, dust through the ventilation system, muggy air. The nurses got skin boils and chronic coughs. They had to keep gas masks on their belts in case the Japanese gassed the tunnels. They had over 1,000 patients a day coming in from up above in the battlefield. The entire island was now under attack. And you can see the various parts of war going on here. And Corregidor was surrendered by Lieutenant Wainwright, May 6, 1942. He surrendered it to the Imperial Japanese. The Imperial Japanese did come into the tunnel. The staff lined up to be inspected. Signs were put up. Jewelry was pilfered. And the nurses stayed in groups in case of rape. The Japanese slapped the staff with the side of bayonets if they broke the rules. And they were fed very little. Very frightening experience. The nurses decided to embroider a Muslim sheet with their names on it, and it was hid in the tunnel. It is now being preserved at Letterman Hospital in San Francisco. On July 2nd, 1942, the Army nurses and Filipino nurses were brought to Manila on a freighter by the Japanese. All the jailed soldiers, physicians, and patients were left behind. The city of Manila was filled with destruction, and this is a very condensed version because the nurses were captured for 3 years by the Japanese. And if you would like to know more about the 3 years, please read the book, which is 434 pages. So at this time, I would love to take questions and comments.
Oh, Jeane, how wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
What an incredible story. And I want you all to know that Jeane is going to be selling, she has written 5 books, and she's going to be selling this one. She was an American combat nurse during World War II. In the back, along with her other books, if you choose to buy them.
Okay, we're open for questions.
Okay.
Here's
There's
one.
one over there.
Oh, good. We have a mic.
We have 2 mics.
Can you tell us if the nurses made it home?
After the 3 years, they did. But it was quite a 3-year adventure. That's all I can tell you.
Okay.
Pardon? Oh, it was quite a difficult 3-year adventure being captured by the Japanese.
So Jean, my question, I understood that women did not serve in combat, but you entitled your book Combat Nurses. Can you explain?
Yes. Combat nurses meant they took care of combat staff, which, remember, 2 nurses were hit by shrapnel.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, sure, I'll get this one. I'll get that one then.
In the meantime, what a tragic story about the segregation and the Black nurses who were so qualified
Yes.
being relegated to just take care of German prisoners or the worst of the jungle situation.
And what I did with the book, it has opposing chapters. The white nurse, then the Black nurse. So you could compare and contrast the 2 nurses. I also have an utmost respect for nurses after 5 years of researching and writing this book. And the question I like to ask is, what would we do without our nurses?
As a nurse, I say yes.
And I say, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, can you you have any follow-up on the nurses right here?
Oh.
Do you have any follow-up on the nurses after they came home?
Yes, several chapters. Some of you got the post-war for the Black nurses. That was a slide. For the white nurses, many of them worked on the Presidio, at Letterman Hospital, helping the rehabilitation of soldiers. That was quite an honor. Some went on to be deployed to the Korean War, which was just around the corner from World War II. There were many, many ill white nurses because of the captivity. And I list all their illnesses, such as loss of teeth from malnutrition.
Hi, I'm wondering if there's any record of post-traumatic stress with the nurses from being in that experience.
I don't think there needs to be. I'm sure it existed, and especially the captured nurses. I wrote about various mental illnesses.
Did you study more about just the nurses, the Black and the white nurses together, how they worked together and how they saw each other, perceived each other before the segregation was lifted and after?
I read such an interesting story that a patient was brought to the white hospital, and the husband, she was hit by a car. She was driven to the white hospital. Her husband went to the Black hospital and said, I came here to see my wife. And he was told she was not there. So the chief Black nurse called over to the white nurse. And sure enough, oh, and she had to ask the husband, was your wife lighter skinned? And that was their only interaction, was by phone. They both worked at Grady Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia, separate wings, A and B, white and Black.
Do we have any other questions?
One over here.
What device did you use to change all of this facts into a novel? How did you do that? Did you have a lot of nurses interacting? Did you pick out a few? How did you do that?
All the nurses and the white nurses and the physicians and the Black nurses and physicians are real people, but they are a composite. I spent years of research and read quite a lot of primary resources, autobiographies. Actually got to read a book from 1941 that was called I Survived Bataan. And they're all true stories. The only fictional part in my book is the romantic parts. But they are true to the time period, which is different. Back then, it was letter writing. You couldn't phone Bataan, you know.
Were the soldiers and patients left on the island to die when they took the nurses to Manila?
I didn't explore that as much as I have many chapters on the 3-year capture of the nurses. I imagine some died just from starvation. The war didn't end till much after 42. I don't recall even finding any information on that.
Do you know if the nurses who were in the jungle came down with malaria and jungle illnesses like all the skin issues and parasites and
Yes, they got sick as much as anybody else. And luckily, the 2 nurses that were hit by shrapnel, it took a long time to recover. They were hit in the chest and leg. So it's, I think it's a sleeping person. No.
Well, I think what we'll do, Jeannie, is we'll end the questioning right here. And we will welcome you next week to come see Sue Carell on the magical mystery tour of Mendocino when she was building the McCollum House. I want to thank you for everybody coming. Jeane's going to be back selling books.
Wait, before I forget, I brought some memorabilia. So come get a free bookmark and look at my memorabilia. And I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Great. Thank you, Jeannie. And thank you for coming to Sunday Symposium, and we'll see you next week.